Hello there, beautiful people. Welcome to the library. The library is a different section of BTV. This is the section where we take a step back from the high octane action. The library is where we get together and we read. Today's story is pulled from A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, written by George R. Martin. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is a collection of three short stories. We will be reading from the first story, The Hedge Knight. The story offered here takes place about 100 years prior to the events described in A Game of Thrones. The spring rains had softened the ground, so Dunk had no trouble digging the grave. He chose a spot on the western slope of a low hill, for the old man had always loved to watch the sunset. Another day done, eh? He would sigh. And who knows what the morrow will bring us, huh, Dunk? Well, one morrow had brought rains that soaked them to the bones, and the other one had brought wet, gusty winds, and the next a chill. By the fourth day, the old man was too weak to ride, and now he was gone. Only a few days past, he had been singing as they rode the old song about going to Goldtown to see a fair maid. But instead of Goldtown, he'd sung of Ashford. Off to Ashford to see the fair maid. Hey ho, hey ho, Dunk thought miserably as he dug. When the hole was deep enough, he lifted the old man's body in his arms and carried him there. He had been a small man and slim. Stripped of hauberk, helm, and sword belt, he seemed to weigh no more than a bag of leaves. Dunk was hugely tall for his age, a shambling, shaggy, big boned boy of 16 or 17 years, no one was quite certain which, who stood closer to 7 feet than to 6, and had only just begun to fill out his frame. The old man had often praised his strength. He had always been generous in his praise. It was all he had to give. He laid him out in the bottom of the grave and stood over him for a time. The smell of rain was in the air again, and he knew he ought to fill the hole before it broke. But it was hard to throw dirt on that tired old face. There ought to be a septon here to say some prayers over him, but he only has me. The old man had taught Dunk all he knew of swords and shields and lances, but had never been much good at teaching him words. I'd leave your sword, but it would rust in the ground, he said at last, apologetic. The gods will give you a new one, I guess. I wish you didn't die, sir. He paused, uncertain what else needed to be said. He didn't know any prayers, not all the way through. The old man had never been much for praying. You were a true knight, and you never beat me. You never beat me when I didn't deserve it, he finally managed. Except that one time in Maidenpool. It was the inn boy who ate that widow woman's pie, not me. I told you. It don't matter now. The gods keep you, sir. He kicked dirt in the hole, then began to fill it methodically, never looking at the thing at the bottom. He had a long life, Dunk thought. He must have been closer to 60 than to 50. And how many men can say that? At least he had lived to see another spring. The sun was westering as he fed the horses. There were three: his swayback Stott, the old man's palfrey, and Thunder, his warhorse, who was ridden only into tourney and battle. The big brown stallion was not as swift or strong as he had once been, but he still had his fierce spirit and his bright eye, and he was more valuable than everything else Dunk owned. If I sold Thunder and Old Chestnut and the saddles and bridles too, I'd come away with enough silver to. Dunk frowned. The only life he knew was the life of a hedge knight, riding from keep to keep, taking service with this lord and that lord, fighting in their battles and eating in their halls until the wars were done, then moving on. There were tournaments from time to time as well, though less often, and he knew that some hedge knights turned robber during lean winters, though the old man had never. I could find another hedge knight in need of a squire to tend to his animals and clean his mail, he thought. Or it might be I could go to some city, to Lannisport or King's Landing, and join the city watch. Or else. He had piled the old man's things under an oak. The cloth purse contained 3 silver stags, 19 copper pennies, and a chipped garnet. Like most hedge knights, the greatest part of his worldly wealth had been tied up in his horses and weapons. Dunk now owned a chainmail hauberk that he had scoured the rust off 1,000 times, an iron half helm with a broad nasal and a dent on the left temple, a sword belt of cracked brown leather, and a longsword in a wood and leather scabbard. A dagger, a razor, a whetstone, greaves and gorget, an 8 foot war lance of turned ash topped by a cruel iron point, and an oaken shield with a scarred metal rim, bearing the sigil of Sir Arlen of Pennytree, a winged chalice, silver on brown. Dunk looked at the shield, scooped up the sword belt, and looked at the shield again. The belt was made for the old man's skinny hips. It would never serve him, no more than the hauberk would. He tied the scabbard to a length of hempen rope, knotted it around his waist, and drew the longsword. The blade was straight and heavy, good castle forged steel. The grip, soft leather wrapped over wood. The pommel, a smooth, polished black stone. Plain as it was, the sword felt good in his hand, and Dunk knew how sharp it was, having worked it with whetstone and oilcloth many a night before they went to sleep. It fits my grip as well as it ever fit his, he thought to himself. And there is a tourney at Ashford Meadow. Sweetfoot had an easier gait than Old Chestnut, but Dunk was still sore and tired when he spied the inn ahead, a tall daub and timber building beside a stream. The warm yellow light spilling from its windows looked so inviting that he could not pass it by. I have 3 silvers, he told himself, enough for a good meal and as much ale as I care to drink. As he dismounted, a naked boy emerged dripping from the stream and began to dry himself on a rough spun brown cloak. Are you the stable boy? Dunk asked him. The lad looked to be no more than 8 or 9, a pasty faced, skinny thing, his bare feet caked up in mud to the ankles. His hair was the queerest thing about him. He had none. I want my palfrey rubbed down and oats for all 3. Can you tend to them? The boy looked at him brazenly. I could if I wanted. Dunk frowned. I'll have none of that. I'm a knight, I'll have you know. You don't look to be a knight. Do all knights look the same? No, but they don't look like you either. Your sword belt's made of rope. So long as it holds my scabbard, it serves. Now see to my horses. You'll get a copper if you do well, and a cloud in the air if you don't. He did not wait to see how the stable boy took that, but turned away and shouldered through the door. At this hour, he would have expected the inn to be crowded, but the common room was almost empty. A young lordling in a fine damask mantle was passed out at one table, snoring softly into a pool of spilled wine. Otherwise, there was no one. Dunk looked around uncertainly until a short, stout, waif-faced woman emerged from the kitchens and said, Sit wherever you like. Is it ale you want or is it food? Both. Dunk took a chair by the window, well away from the sleeping man. There's good lamb, roasted with a crust of herbs, and some ducks me son shot down. Which will you have? He had not eaten at an inn in half a year, maybe even more. Both. The woman laughed. Well, you're big enough for it. She drew a tankard of ale and brought it to his table. Will you be wanting a room for the night as well? No. Dunk would have liked nothing better than a soft straw mattress and a roof above his head, but he needed to be careful with his coin. The ground would serve. Some food, some ale, and it's on to Ashford for me. How much farther is it? A day's ride. Bear north when the road forks at the Burn Mill. Is me boy seen to your horses, or has he run off again? No, he's there, said Dunk. You seem to have no custom. Half the town's gone to see the turning. Me own son would as well if I allowed it. They'll have this in when I go, but the boy would sooner swagger about with soldiers. And the girl turns into sighs and giggles every time a knight rides by. I swear I couldn't tell you why. Knights are built the same as other men, and I never seen a joust change the prices of eggs. She eyed Dunk curiously. His sword and shield told her one thing, his rope belt and rough spun tunic quite another. You're bound for the tournament yourself? He took a sip of the ale before he answered. A nut brown color it was, and thick on the tongue, just the way he liked it. Aye, he said. I mean to be a champion. Do you now? The innkeep answered, politely enough. Across the room, the lordling raised his head from the wine puddle. His face had a sallow, unhealthy cast to it, beneath a rat's nest of sandy brown hair, and blonde stubble crusted his chin. He rubbed his mouth, blinked at Dunk, and said, I dreamed of you. His hand trembled as he pointed a finger. You, you stay away from here. You stay away from me, do you hear? You stay well away from me. Dunk stared at him uncertainly. My lord? The innkeep leaned close. Never you mind that one, sir. All he does is drink and talk about his dreams. I'll see about that food. She bustled off. Food. The lordling made the word sound like an obscenity. He staggered to his feet, one hand on the table to keep himself from falling. I'm gonna be sick, he announced. The front of his tunic was crusty red with old wine stains. I wanted a horse, but there's none to be found here. All gone to Ashford Meadow, got to be good. I need some wine. He lurched unsteadily from the common room, and Dunk heard him climbing steps, singing underneath his breath. A sad creature, thought Dunk. But why did he think he knew me? He pondered that a moment over his ale. The lamb was as good as any he had ever eaten, and the duck was even better, cooked with cherries and lemons, and not near as greasy as most. The innkeep brought buttered peas as well, and oaten bread, still hot from her ovens. This is what it means to be a knight, he told himself as he sucked the last bit of meat off the bone. Good food and ale whenever I want it, and no one to clap me in the head. He had a second tankard of ale with the meal, a third to wash it down, and a fourth because there was no one to tell him he couldn't. And when he was done, he paid the woman with a silver stag and still got back a fistful of coppers. It was full dark by the time Dunk emerged. His stomach was full, and his purse was a little lighter, but he felt good as he walked to the stables. Ahead, he heard a horse whicker. Easy, lad, a boy's voice said. Dunk quickened his step, frowning. He found the stable boy mounted on Thunder and wearing the old man's armor. The hauberk was longer than he was, and he had to tilt the helm back on his head, or else it would have covered his eyes. He looked utterly intent and utterly absurd. Dunk stopped in the stable door and laughed. The boy looked up, flushed, faltered to the ground. My lord, I did not mean thief. Dunk said, trying to sound stern. Take off that armor and be glad that Thunder didn't kick you in that foolish head. He's a war horse, not a boy's pony. The boy took off the helm and flung it to the straw. I could ride him as well as you, he said, bold as you please. Close your mouth. I want none of your insolence. The hauberk, too. Take it off. What did you think you were doing? How can I tell you with my mouth closed? The boy squirmed out of the chainmail and let it fall. You can open your mouth to answer, said Dunk. Now pick up that mail, shake off the dirt, and put it back where you found it. And the half helm, too. Did you feed the horses as I told you? And rub down Sweetfoot? Yes, the boy said as he shook straw from the mail. You're going to Ashford, aren't you? Take me with you, sir. The innkeep had warned him of this. And what might your mother say to that? My mother? The boy wrinkled up his face. My mother's dead. She wouldn't say anything. He was surprised. Wasn't the innkeep his mother? Perhaps he was only prenticed to her. Dunk's head was a little fuzzy from the ale. Are you an orphan boy? He asked uncertainly. Are you? The boy threw back. I was once, Dunk admitted, till the old man took me in. If you took me, I could squire for you. I have no need of squire, Dunk said. Every knight needs a squire, the boy said, and you look as though you need one more than most. Dunk raised a hand threateningly. And you look as though you need a cloud in the ear, it seems to me. Fill me a sack of oats. I'm off for Ashford. Alone. If the boy was frightened, he hid it well. For a moment, he stood there defiant, his arms crossed. But just as Dunk was about to give up on him, the lad turned and went for the oats. Dunk was relieved. A pity. I couldn't. A pity. I could. He has a good life here. I couldn't. A better one than he'd have squiring for a hedge knight. A pity I could. Taking him would be no kindness. Dunk thought to himself. He could still feel the lad's disappointment, though. As he mounted Sweetfoot and took up Thunder's lead, Dunk decided that a copper penny might cheer him up. Here, lad, for your help. He flipped the coin down at him with a smile, but the stable boy made no attempt to catch it. It fell in the dirt between his bare feet, and there he let it lie. You'll scoop it up as soon as I am gone, Dunk told himself. He turned the palfrey and rode from the inn, leading the other two horses. The trees were bright with moonlight, and the sky was cloudless and speckled with stars. Yet, as he headed down the road, he could feel the stable boy watching his back, sullen and silent. The shadows of the afternoon were growing long when Dunk reined up on the edge of broad Ashford Meadow. 30 pavilions had already risen on the grassy field. Some were small, some large, some square, some round, some of sailcloth, some of linen, some of silk, but all were brightly colored, with long banners streaming from their center poles, brighter than a field of wildflowers, with rich reds and sunny yellows, countless shades of green and blue, deep blacks and grays and purples. The old man had ridden with some of these knights. Others Dunk knew from tales told in common rooms and round campfires. Though he had never learnt the magic of reading or writing, the old man had been relentless when it came to teaching him heraldry, often drilling him as they rode. The nightingales belonged to Lord Cairn of the Marches, as skilled with the high harp as he was with a lance. The crowned stag was for Sir Lionel Baratheon, the laughing storm. Dunk picked out the tarly huntsman, House Dondarian's purple lightning, the red apple of the Fossways. There roared the lion of Lannister, gold on crimson. And there, the dark green sea turtle of the Estermont swam across a pale green field. The brown tent beneath a red stallion could only belong to Sir Otho Bracken, who was called the Brute of Bracken, since slaying Lord Quentin Blackwood 3 years past during a tourney at King's Landing. Dunk heard that Sir Otho had struck so hard with the blunted long axe that he staved in the visor of Lord Blackwood's helm and the face beneath it. He saw some Blackwood banners as well, on the west edge of the meadow, as distant from Sir Otho as they could be. Marbrand, Mallister, Cargill, Westerland, Swan, Mullendore, Hightower, Florence, Frey, Penrose, Stokeworth, Derry, Perrin, Wild. 7 hells! It seemed as though every lordly house of the west and the south had sent a knight or three to Ashford to see the fair maid and brave the lists in her honor. Yet, however fine their pavilions were to look upon, he knew there was no place for him. He knew there was no place there for him. A threadbare wool cloak would be all the shelter he had tonight. While the lords and great knights dined on capons and suckling pigs, Dunk's supper would be a hard, stringy piece of salt beef. He knew full well that if he made his camp upon that gaudy field, he would need to suffer both silent scorn and open mockery. A few perhaps would treat him kindly, yet in a way that was almost worse. A hedge knight must hold tight to his pride. Without it, he was no more than a sellsword. I must earn my place in that company. If I fight well, some lord may take me into his household. I will ride in noble company then, and eat fresh meat every night in a castle hall, and raise my own pavilion at tourneys. But first I must do well. Reluctantly, he turned his back on the tourney grounds and led his horses into the trees. On the outskirts of the great meadow, a good half-mile from town and castle, he found a place where a bend in the brook had formed a deep pool. Reeds grew thick along its edge, and a tall, leafy elm presided over all. The spring grass there was as green as any knight's banner and soft to the touch. It was a pretty spot, and no one had yet laid claim to it. This will be my pavilion, Dunk told himself. A pavilion roofed with leaves, greener even than the banners of the Tyrells and the Estermonts. His horses came first. After they had been tended, he stripped and waded into the pool to wash away the dust of travel. A true knight is cleanly as well as godly, the old man had always said, insisting that they wash themselves head to heels every time the moon turned, whether they smelled sour or not. Now that he was a knight, Dunk vowed he would do the same. He sat naked under the elm while he dried, enjoying the warmth of the spring air on his skin as he watched a dragonfly move lazily among the reeds. Why would they name it a dragonfly? He wondered. It looks nothing like a dragon. Not that Dunk had ever seen a dragon. The old man had, though. Dunk had heard the story half 100 times, how Sir Arlen had just been a little boy when his grandfather had taken him to King's Landing, and how they'd seen the last dragon there the year before it died. She'd been a green female, small and stunted, her wings withered. None of her eggs had ever hatched. Some say King Egan poisoned her, the old man would tell. The third Egan, that would be. Not King Daeron's father, but the one they named Dragonbane, or Egan the Unlikely. He was afraid of dragons, for he'd seen his uncle's beast devour his own mother. The summers have been shorter since the last dragon died, and the winters longer and crueler. The air began to cool as the sun dipped below the tops of the trees. When Dunk felt goose flesh prickling his arms, he beat his tunic and breeches against the trunk of the elm to knock off the worst of the dirt, and donned them once again. On the morrow, he could seek out the master of games and enroll his name. But he had other matters he ought to look into tonight if he hoped to challenge. He did not need to study his reflection in the water to know that he did not look much a knight. So he slung Sir Arlen's shield across his back to display the sigil. Hobbling the horses, Dunk left them to crop the thick green grass beneath the elm as he set out on foot for the tourney grounds. In normal times, the meadow served as a commons for the folk of Ashford Town across the river, but now it was transformed. A second town had sprung up overnight, a town of silk instead of stone, larger and fairer than its elder sister. Dozens of merchants had erected their stalls along the edge of the field, selling felts and fruits, belts and boots, hides and hawks, earthenware, gemstones, pewterwork, spices, feathers, and all manner of other goods. Jugglers, puppeteers, and magicians wandered amongst the crowds, plying their trades, as did the whores and the cut purses. Dunk kept a wary hand on his coin. When he caught the smell of sausages sizzling over a smoky fire, his mouth began to water. He bought one with a copper from his pouch and a horn of ale to wash it down. As he ate, he watched a patched wooden knight battle a painted wooden. He watched a painted wooden knight. Excuse me, I'm sorry, guys. He watched a painted wooden knight battle a painted wooden dragon. The puppeteer who worked the dragon was good to watch too. A tall drink of water, with the olive skin and black hair of Dorn. She was slim as a lance, with no breast to speak of, but Dunk liked her face and the way her fingers made the dragon snap and slither at the end of its strings. He would have tossed the girl a copper if he'd had one to spare, but right now he needed every coin. There were armorers amongst the merchants, as he had hoped. A Tyroshi with a forked blue beard was selling ornate helms, gorgeous, fantastical things, wrought in the shapes of birds and beasts, and chased with gold and silver. Elsewhere, he found a sword maker hawking cheap steel blades, and another whose work was much finer, but it was not a sword he lacked. The man he needed was all the way down at the end of the row, a shirt of fine chainmail and a pair of lobster steel gauntlets displayed on the table before him. Dunk inspected them closely. You do great work. None better. A stumpy man. The smith was no more than 5 feet tall, yet wide as Dunk about the chest and the arms. He had a black beard, he had huge hands, and not a single trace of humility. I need armor for the tourney, Dunk told him. A suit of good mail with gorget greaves and great helm. The old man's half helm would fit his head, but he wanted more protection for his face than a nasal bar alone could provide. The armorer looked him up and down. You're a big one, but I've armored bigger. He came out from behind the table. Kneel. I want to measure those shoulders. Aye, and that thick neck of yours. Dunk knelt. The armorer laid a length of knotted rawhide along his shoulders, grunted, slipped it about his throat, grunted again. Lift your arm. No, the right one. He grunted a third time. Now you can stand. The inside of a leg, the thickness of his calf, and the size of his waist elicited further grunts. I have some pieces in me wagon that might do for you, the man said when he was done. Nothing prettied up with gold or silver, mind you. Just good steel, strong and plain. I make helmets that look like helmets, not winged pigs and queer foreign shit. But mine will serve you better if you take a lance in the face. That's all I want, said Dunk. How much? 800 stags, for I'm feeling kind. 800? It was more than he had expected. I, I, I could trade you some old armor made for a smaller man. A half helm, a mail hauberk. Stilly Pate only sells his own work, the man declared. but it might be I can make use of the metal if it ain't too rusted. I'll take it and armor you for 600. Dunk could beseech Pate to give him the armor on trust, but he knew what sort of answer that would likely get. He had traveled with the old man long enough to learn that merchants were notoriously mistrustful of hedge knights. Some, some of, some of whom were little better than robbers. I'll give you 2 silvers now, and the armor and the rest of the coin on the morrow. The armorer studied him for a moment. 2 silvers buys you a day. After that, I sell me work to the next man. Dunk scooped the stags out of his pouch and placed them in the armorer's calloused hand. You'll get it all. Mean to be a champion here. Do you? Pate bit one of the coins. And these others, I suppose they just came to cheer you on.